we'll tell you something. Okay, for the purpose of the recording, Melissa Fox and I, Joelle and Clary, welcome you to week 4 of the Slow Read of Mansfield Park, sponsored by the Jane Austen Society of North America, West Michigan region. Reminder, since we're in volume 2 tonight, if you can't, I can translate the different chapter numbers from one version to the other. And if you have the Penguin, you'll notice that it gives both on the pages. So anyway, this volume has taken off on us, I think. And at the end of today's section, we'll find ourselves in the dead middle of the book by pagination, so halfway through. And next week, after we get through all the things that happened this week, the plot will reset a little bit again, which it will keep doing. So where to begin tonight could be difficult as we look at chapters 19 to 24. There's so much to talk about. But I just want to mention that an excellent way to review if you're starting to feel a little bit overwhelmed is just to skim. In fact, I have a rubber finger, and just turning pages, letting your eyes kind of idly drop on the page, you'd be surprised at how much comes back to mind what you're reminded of. So in a minute, we'll decide where else to start. But Laura mentioned that she was really surprised. I had no idea what the hairstyles were. I think I just searched outre haircuts in the Regency era. So here's one.
One example.
I haven't seen this.
Looks very modern.
Isn't that something? Yeah, it looks fairly contemporary. And I saw others.
And then there was another one here that's kind of cute. It almost looks like she has her hair in a bun, but it's very short.
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah,
right, they short around.
Yeah, I had no idea. So it's really fun, the little bits and pieces of things that we learn.
Yeah, that's actually the link you sent us. You can go into the virtual exhibition, and that's under room 3, the queer fashion, a controversial hairstyle.
Oh, is that the hair also? Maybe that's where I saw the other photos. Actually, I didn't send when that one link that I sent to the Jane Austen house courting controversy, I think just took you to the section on slavery, but you could get to the rest of it. Beware of spoilers if you do that.
Right. That's true.
But I'm glad to know about that one in fashion. Okay, so things that have struck you, noticed, surprises today besides Fanny's hair, but we can really start almost anywhere and find our way to where we're going.
I was just charmed. One of the in chapter, the first chapter, when Fanny is going in to finally go greet her uncle after he's returned. Austen's writing is so fun. It's pausing a moment for what she knew would not come, for a courage which the outside of no door had ever supplied to her.
Yeah. And that's humorous. There are so many. We could just spend the entire hour reading funny lines to each other. Some of them are sardonic. It really kind of depends. So we might start paying some attention to the types of humor that we're witnessing. Like, well, we'll pick some more up as we go along. Unless somebody else has a bit of humor you want to share now before something else.
Oh, I had one that I came across, and again when I was looking through the pages today. On page 181 in the Penguin, it's the end of chapter 20, the last paragraph. This is when they're taking down the theater. Mrs. Norris contrived.
Just a second, that's volume 2, chapter 2. I'll just say chapter 2.
Volume 2, chapter 2, chapter 20, page 181 in Penguin. Last paragraph.
Oh, yeah.
Mrs. Norris contrived to remove one article from his sight that might have distressed him. The curtain over which she had presided with such talent and such success went off with her to her cottage, where she happened to be particularly in want of green baize.
There's just so much along that line planted in here. Anything else just come to mind? We'll get there. And as your eyeball scrolls across some things. Actually, let me first ask you before I forget about it, the dates. I have not noticed anywhere, I've not really gone searching, but I've seen in article after article about what the date, setting the dates, whether before or after the 1807 abolition of the slave trade. And I really think what I rehearsed for you last week, I checked a couple of times. And it seems to me that from the time Sir Thomas leaves, a couple of years pass until the end of the novel. But this says that he was away in Antigua for 2 years. And I don't think so. Does anybody else have information to the contrary?
He was away for 2 years. And I was reading the material today from
Marcia Hoff?
yeah, and their scholars disagree, but some of them say he was away for 2 years.
They all do. It's just whether it's say 1807 to 1809 or 1810 to 1812, but I don't see it in the text. So if anybody can come up with something, please let me know, because it's certainly possible for somebody to put out there 2 years and it's not necessarily questioned. And I have the matter of interpretation in chapter 21. Should we just get that out of the way? In the Penguin, I think it's page 184 in the Penguin, otherwise it's 3-2 around the 3rd page. This is when Fanny and Edmund are talking the day after. It's chapter 21 for us, or 2-3. When Edmund is telling Fanny, you're one of those who are too silent in the evening circle. I only wish you would talk to him more. Okay, did you get my question? Whether her dead silence, and let's look at that, because I looked like almost the Lone Ranger. I did find someone else who agreed with my interpretation here, but I'd like to know what you think. But I do talk to him more than I used. I'm sure I do. Did you not hear me ask him about the slave trade last night? Edmund, I did, and was in hopes the question would be followed up by others. It would have pleased your uncle to be inquired of farther. Fanny, and I longed to do it, but there was such a dead silence. And while my cousins were sitting by without speaking a word or seeming at all interested in the subject, I thought it would appear as if I wanted to set my off at their expense by showing a curiosity and pleasure in his information, which he must wish his own daughters to feel. What do you think?
The dead silence is like from everybody else in the room. I didn't really think it's like he looked at her with the dead silence.
No.
I thought it was, I don't know if everyone was horrified that she would ask such a thing, or they just didn't want to be, weren't interested.
Right.
Does anyone disagree? Anyone thought that Sir Thomas just did not respond to her at all?
Sir Thomas didn't respond, but nobody else filled any of that silence.
It seems to me Sir Thomas must have responded.
That's what, yeah, he thought you would have followed it up with another question.
Right.
Conversation.
Yeah, now, Wendy, if you read Marcia's article today, I think that she says, as many people have before her, said, and part of the whole post-colonial reading of the slave trade after, it's a fellow named Edward Said, if you're not familiar, have put that out there. And I don't know, again, whether no one has really read it carefully again, but it's that Sir Thomas did not deign to respond to her. That and no, it's not, nobody seems to mention the rest of the people in the room. But Wendy, would you argue that?
Oh, give me argue that the other
that Sir Thomas did not respond at all to Fanny. Now this is kept very ambivalent. I mean, that Jane Austen doesn't suggest anything is interesting too. Bev, what do you have to say?
I think I've been listening to it as well as reading it, and in listening to it, you really don't get that impression at all. It was her saying, his own children didn't ask any questions, and why would I ask a question if no one is asking a question? Yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, those girls could not care less about anything he is saying. And when she talks about, I wouldn't put myself forward that way. She's always so aware of what, Mariah and Julia are doing. And if they're not doing it, why would you even think that I'd be the one doing it?
Well, I can respond to that comment, Bev. That's
okay.
Very, I was in a situation, I was recalling a situation in which there were several people sitting around a table, as these people would have been at Mansfield Park. And I had a conversation with one other person at this table. And after the conversation had gone on for a few minutes, I realized that no one else on the table was participating. It was a conversation between two of us, and I stopped talking and it was silent. And that is the same thing that happened here. They had nothing to say. It was a dangerous topic. They weren't going to start. They didn't know anything. And Sir Thomas wasn't going to continue the conversation with one person. And so there was no other topic of conversation in the setting at this time.
And because Fanny did not ask a further question.
Right.
Because she realized, as I did in that setting, that it was a conversation between two, not with the group.
Well, it wasn't at that point, just no one else said anything and she didn't follow it up. I think does that sound like it was Edmund's point? I did.
Yes.
And with the hopes the question would be followed up by others, meaning to me, he must have said something, whether it was just genial or
He
to
replied to her.
question. Yeah. And then later, you're right, whoever brought up that she didn't want to jump in again without anyone else, by showing a curiosity and pleasure and avoiding that situation that you described, Wendy. Okay.
Which is what I did in that setting. I mean, what I did was exactly what Fanny is describing.
Liz, did you have something to add?
Well, I think the text on your specific question of whether Sir Thomas responded to her or not, I think the text is just ambiguous. I don't think there's any way to come to a definitive answer from the text. But if it is, I mean, I had assumed, when I was reading this, I would have assumed that her question hit a nerve, just knowing that he's going to end up as a 21st century reader, like, ooh, ouch, and yet Fanny is completely, if it did hit a nerve, then Fanny's completely oblivious to that, because her reticence is because she doesn't want to make her cousins look bad. She's afraid that she'll look like she's currying favor if she keeps
or her uncle, right?
Right. And so she doesn't want to look like she's trying to show off. But she's a very sensitive person, right? So if it were politically sensitive in this household, I would think that Fanny would be aware of that, and yet she doesn't cite that in her reasoning to Edmund.
Yeah, and it doesn't sound like it to me, Bev.
Right, because he says, she says, did you not hear me? Like you said, ask him about the slave trade. And he said, I did, and was in hopes the question would be followed up by others. It would have pleased your uncle to be inquired of farther, that he was more than happy to talk about it, because they don't have any of the sense, they don't have the sensibility that we might have. He's talking about his plantation and his success that he had when he went down there. So for her to inquire of that and how had he been successful, and it gives him an opportunity to brag on himself and without appearing to, right? But to say that he had resolved things and come home, and for her to say, well, tell me more, and she's not that girl.
And we want to keep charting Sir Thomas through this, which is one reason I suggested, if you haven't read it before, to hold up on reading the article. And in fact, Catherine Sutherland wrote the introduction to the Penguin edition quite a while back, when everything was a post-colonial reading, and that was kind of overwhelming every other topic. And it certainly has raised serious issues. But we'll get back to Sir Thomas and keep following him. But one thing that she mentions, and she gets into a little more detail, I think this is there, not in Marsh's article, that to some extent, Antigua planters had less to lose from the abolition laws going into effect, because their plantings were older, the island was less fertile anymore. And so that, they were they were in direct competition, so that the slowing down of the slave trade, plus also, so that might be one reason why Sir Thomas might have taken an abolitionist stance, despite being a planter. So those are things that we'll really kind of set aside for now. And if we want to take them up again, based on who he is in his home, the man that we're following, we could do some reasoning by analogy. But anything else anyone wants to say along that line right now?
A different topic, but end of chapter 4 is when her uncle leaves and says something about him, about her being 16 years old. And then chapter 5, such was the state of affairs in the month of July, and Fanny just reached her 18th year. So
oh, chapter 4 in volume 1.
Yeah, way back to 4. Yeah, 4.
Yeah.
Way back. So it was the 2 years, but it doesn't really say that.
Oh, what page is that? I want to look at that later.
The very end, just before the actual chapter 4, the last paragraph, her uncle says,
chapter 4.
Yeah.
Okay.
Volume 1, chapter 4. I fear if her brother comes to visit, I fear he must find his sister at 16, in some respects, too much like his sister at 10. So she was 16 when he left. And she's 18 when he comes back.
Okay, I have to look back.
That's the 2 years, so.
Yeah, because there's a year there that we don't have narrated, it seems to me. Anyway, it's a little thing, but one other thing, I sent you that supplement regarding other current affairs, because Austen, it was somebody else who said, I can't remember whether it was Walter Scott in a review of Austen, who said she paints on an inch square piece of ivory. She's quoted as saying that about herself very often today. But everybody said there's no scope, it's just a domestic novel. And this is arguing otherwise. And in fact, the examples that I gave you about militia encampments in Pride and Prejudice, when in fact, Jane Austen was living in Kent then to some extent, which would have been ground zero for an invasion from Napoleon. But we have The Strange Business in America, which probably argues for the War of 1812. So that would be about the time period exactly when Austen was publishing it. And those are kind of the dates that I accept for the novel. But did you take a look at Cheryl Craig's piece on Sense and Sensibility, the economics of Sense and Sensibility, where she raises the 3 Johns? And if you didn't have a chance to read it, take a look sometime, because I really think it's interesting. The 3 John Bulls are known, they're gentry, as is Crawford, Rushworth, and Sir Thomas. Austen very rarely writes about the aristocracy, certainly as main characters, but they had real responsibilities. So the landed gentry, who were the Parliament representatives, had seats in Parliament, were responsible for taking care of the poor. We do hear in Mansfield Park, Aunt Bertram said, or Nora says at some point, well, Fanny has nothing to do, she can get the work basket, which would have been things for charity and this kind of thing. Emma visits sick people. We get very little mentions of these things, but especially the things that I mentioned here and that Cheryl Craig brings up shows you how, especially her first readers, people would have known about this. And the abolition stuff was everywhere. There were pamphlets, it was in the news, it was discussed, so that the scope of Austen's knowledge and stuff alluded to in her novels is much greater than a lot of people give credit for. And you can see in most of the movies, none of that appears. It's kind of romance and that's it. Okay, anything more about any of that? Otherwise, other things you'd just like to share?
I would just say one movie that does try to bring that in is, I think, like not my favorite adaptation, but it's the Mansfield Park adaptation from maybe, I don't know, was that 15 years ago, 10 years ago?
I think
That's
1998.
Billy Piper?
No.
No.
This is Francis
It's the
O'Connor.
one, yeah, Francis O'Connor.
Oh, yeah.
It's the one where they made Fanny's character much more like Jane Austen's character, and they used stuff
Writer.
from Jane's correspondence with her sister and put some of those things into Fanny's character. So Fanny becomes this like witty, self-confident.
Mhm.
But in that one, Tom Bertram, when he returns from Antigua, is haunted by what he saw there, and scenes of slavery, and that's very explicit. That's sort of the theory in that movie. That's the theory
Yeah,
of
that's a
why he
post-colonial
turned
take.
bad. Which I don't. I think it's a liberty taken. I don't think that that's really there in Austen. But
Oh,
I would
no.
just say that's one movie that did attempt to portray the political underpinnings of Austen's writing.
Yeah.
But I think did it badly.
Yeah, when Fanny's in a carriage riding to Mansfield Park, they're going along a coastal road and they're singing coming from a ship that's anchored, and she asks about it. He says those are slaves singing. And so it's kind of there, a lot. But the really egregious part is that Tom is an artist. He comes back and is a drunk, which is not the Tom we see come back. But he has drawn pictures of his father whipping slaves in Antigua, raping a Black woman, stuff like that, which is really in your face. And, we have to decide for ourselves based on the Sir Thomas we read, whether that's even possible, given the Jane Austen character, or whether Patricia Rozema was drawing on, a little more than has been credited. But yeah,
well, I
that's
just think her goal in that movie is something different. I think she's trying to create something new out of the. But I don't think she was. I mean, she wasn't at all trying to be faithful to Jane Austen. That wasn't her
And
goal at all.
Frances O'Connor as Fanny is portrayed as writing blood and thunder tales like Jo March in Little Women, or Jane Austen's crazy juvenilia, and she addresses the camera directly. So it's a very different movie. And Fanny Price is nothing like the Fanny Price that we're reading about in the novel.
Yeah.
Interesting to see sometime though. Okay. Anything else? Just off the top of your head, something that bonked you on the head you were surprised about?
Something, I just want to mention something that I think about when I read about the family is Elizabeth Gaskell in her book, Wives and Daughters. She distinguishes the 3 levels of moneyedness. And so the lowest level is somebody who isn't poor. It's a doctor, right? And his daughter. But they literally talk to each other all the time. And then at the next level, the barons and baronets, they have nannies and servants, and they interact with their children, but not in any great way, not in any day-to-day way. And it seemed like that was partly this, that there are all these other people, especially in their young lives, that the dad, Mr. Bertram, he's there, and he asks about them, and he asks them how their life is going, but it's not an interactive relationship. It's almost like an oversight relationship.
Yeah. Okay, let's look at chapter 19 in that respect. Have we seen Sir Thomas? Well, we haven't seen much of Sir Thomas, but were you surprised at who he was walking in the door the first evening that he was there? He's telling stories about French privateers. He's the life of the party, we're told. We'll see whether he ever again is the life of a party, but he's certainly happy to be home to Penelope, his wife, who's been waiting. And what's Lady Bertram's response to him? Now, there's a lot of humor there. This is in chapter 19 or chapter 1 in volume 2.
What was it?
167 up in the Penguin.
Unfortunately, there are several editions of the Penguin. I have a different one. Can you just say the chapter number and how many pages it?
Yes, it's chapter 19 or chapter 1, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, like 5th page in. It's pretty much in the center of the chapter. but it's Thomas was indeed the life of the party. Do you see that? It's kind of a next page.
Does that start the beginning of the paragraph?
No, the paragraph we're going to look at is but
Starts
not
with what?
of the circle was he listened to with such unbroken, unalloyed enjoyment as by his wife.
Okay,
Yes.
so what does the first sentence say?
Sir
But not
Thomas
one
was
of the
indeed the life
circle.
of the party.
Was he listened to with
Okay,
such,
got it. Not one of the
Okay.
circle was he listened to.
right,
Yes.
right. Who was really extremely happy to see him.
She
And
was
whose
almost fluttered.
whose feelings were so warmed by his sudden arrival as to place her nearer agitation than she had been for the last 20 years. And look on. Yeah, Bev just said she was almost fluttered for a few minutes and still remained so sensibly animated as to put away her work, move Pug from her side, and give all her attention and all the rest of her sofa to her husband. And it's, I mean, that's Lady Bertram on speed.
Mhm.
Yep.
She began particularly to feel how dreadfully she must have missed him.
Must have at the end of that paragraph, right? Yeah. And so it's real, that's really hilarious. On the next page, there's something related to her. But anyway, the next paragraph begins with Mrs. Norris. Do you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Let's just, okay. How did Mrs. Norris respond to this? And how does it help characterize her?
Oh, she's upset.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, about what?
She says she could hardly be said to show any sign of alarm, but she was vexed by the manner of his return. It had left her nothing to do. Instead of being sent for out of the room and seeing him first and having to spread the happy news about the house, Sir Thomas was a very reasonable dependence, perhaps on the nerves of his wife and children, had sought no confidant but the butler, and had been following him almost instantaneously into the drawing room.
Didn't get
He
to
felt
say he was
destroyed.
dead, and I didn't get to say he's back.
And I just, I love it. If you look kind of, yeah, next paragraph maybe, or at the end of this one, where he's in the middle of his story about the French privateer,
Oh, yeah.
and she proposes soup.
Soup. She keeps wanting to
That
give us
reminds me, I can't think of her name. John Middleton's mother-in-law in Sense and Sensibility, when Marianne Dashwood is so upset over losing Willoughby. They're in London, and in one of the film, I think it's the Emma Thompson film, the actor keeps peeking around the door. Is there nothing I can get her? And she comes back and says, olives? They're just, Austen is just wonderful with this kind of detail. But why? Okay, how do servants come in during this section?
Well, Mrs. Norris is
First-
bossing them around.
Yeah. And she said, would Sir Thomas have consented to eat? She might have gone to the housekeeper with troublesome directions and insulted the footman with injunctions of dispatch. As it turns out, and what's the name of the butler? We actually get a name. Baddeley. She orders Lady Bertram to speak for tea directly. She has to take over something.
Mhm.
So, and can you just off the tops of your heads, think of other interactions with servants, either in tonight's reading or any that we've recognized or we've seen earlier? I would say there are more allusions to servants in this novel than in any other by Jane Austen.
When they were at Southerton, she was getting stuff off of the servants so that she could bring it back.
Oh, yeah.
Cream cheese.
Quail eggs.
Right.
She knows how to flatter and go away with things.
So that
What
they
else?
insist on her taking them.
Exactly.
And she treats Fanny as a servant.
We'll talk about levels of intimacy. I think I asked about that. Fanny is not much more than a servant, but is certainly ordered around by Aunt Bertram or Aunt Norris, isn't she?
She also feigns concern for the coachman you know, when,
Oh, yeah.
you know, there's the story about like when they were driving to Southerton, you know, and I got out and walked because,
Right.
but then there's another time when, you know, she doesn't think that their
Yes.
coach should be used. She's trying to talk them out of calling the coach. It's like, oh, we can't do that to you know, the poor coachman. You know, I know how much he hates to blah blah blah. So when it's convenient for her, she feigns concern for
Yeah.
the coachman and the
Yeah.
horses.
Right. And that's in chapter 20 or chapter 2,
Okay.
where my page 176, but it would be on about the 3rd page of text, where she's really trying to overwhelm Sir Thomas, who has asked her to justify her role during the lover's vows. He says, you know, the young people I can understand, but you I can't. So she's just telling him how she's saved him all this money, just overwhelming. And so she's taking full credit for Mr. Rushworth for arranging that marriage, and
Yep.
tells that she even got Lady Bertram to go in the middle of the winter. And in the middle of that page 176, she's even talking. I said, oh, he went up to his room. He was in the process of putting on his wig. I said, Coachman, you had much better not go. Your lady and I shall be very safe. You know how steady Stephen is. And Charles has been upon the leaders so often now that I'm sure there is no fear. Is she manipulating him?
Mhm.
Like something bad could happen if you don't go. And of course, at the end of that paragraph, she tells Sir Thomas, she's talking about the noble animals. My object was accomplished and I caught a dreadful cold, but that I did not regard. So it's completely about herself, isn't it? Did you, how many of you actually had a chance to read that paragraph on the page, the supplement, the last paragraph called Naming Aunt Norris?
Mm-mm.
Okay. Jean, would you just tell people briefly what that's about?
Robert Norris had been supposedly in favor of abolition, and then he turned around and completely changed his view and supported the slave trade. And so the abolitionists did not like him. So they're assuming that Jane Austen chose to name Mrs. Norris after this man.
Yeah, Robert
Ah.
Norris was a former owner and slave ship captain. And he had spilled to this Clarkson, whose history of the slave trade and abolition Austen had read and loved. And he told him about the inhumanity and justice involved. And a few months later, he was testifying representing the merchants in Liverpool, giving an entirely false picture about
How
what
happy they were.
during the, right.
It was the
during
best trip of their life, traveling on the Middle
happiest
Passage.
period. Does Aunt Norris ever give false pictures? She's certainly doing that here, isn't she? And why would you speculate about why you think she treats the servants so badly? Fanny too, but what could be her motives?
She's trying to make herself seem more important. Her sister has done really well, and she's just a widow of a clergyman, so she's nobody. But she wants to be a part of the family, and it was always the Bertrams and herself. We did this for you, Fanny, and we did all these wonderful things. She wants to really be a part of that, and so she's better than everybody else.
Yeah, she's self-aggrandizing. And do you remember when Fanny is invited to dinner at the Grants in a later chapter? How does Aunt Bertram respond? Or Aunt Norris, I'm sorry.
Why would they invite you?
They must be doing that
Aunt
on
Bertram
my
says
account.
that too.
You're doing that on my account and on my sister's account and not on your account. And don't forget how grateful you should be to us for them inviting you.
And Fanny believes it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, at least she can't talk back, can she?
She doesn't talk back.
This is where, it's kind of, remember when Aunt Norris was telling her in the coach when she was taking her to Mansfield Park when she was 9 or 10 years old? Remember, you're the lowest and the least, etc. Exactly the same thing here, isn't it? And it's about a coach ride until Sir Thomas overrules her. So yeah, there's a lot of self-aggrandizing. And to kind of understand that, let's go back to something we've talked about before. The class layering, in fact, in this reading for tonight, it's been talked about in terms of intimacy, levels of intimacy, which is why Sir Thomas is objecting to having all kinds of people in his home when he comes back, right? So who are the outsiders who are just completely on the outside as far as he's concerned?
Yates.
Yates?
Grant.
Yates, get him out of here.
What did you say, Laura?
The Grants and the
The
Crawfords.
Grants, yeah. And we do hear in the next chapter that he barely knew them before he left, so he would have considered them outsiders, which is why he wasn't inviting them to dinner. Any other outsiders as far as Sir Thomas is concerned?
Well, Mr. Rushworth is an outsider, but he's willing to let him in.
Yeah, he's in between, kind of, because he's engaged to his daughter.
Mhm.
What about the Crawfords?
They're outsiders.
Yeah, I mean, some outsiders have more privileges than others, or are thought more highly of, but they're all outside the family. Okay, the family unit, we understand. Aunt Norris is kind of always working to assure herself, if not them, that she's one of them. She's indispensable, and because of Lady Bertram, she is to some extent. But what about in between people? Who's in between? Servants are even below them, by the way.
What do you mean by in between?
In between family, the
Well,
outsiders.
We've gotten rid of Mr. Yates, the Crawfords, and they might be considered in between. Is that what you're thinking? The Crawfords are kind
Yeah,
of
level more like outsiders toward in between. Who's Fanny?
Fanny's Cinderella.
Fanny is firmly one of them. I mean, she belongs to this house. She's not an equal, but she firmly belongs to the house. William, when he comes, is an in-betweener, you know, because he is family, but he's an outsider. But I
They
think
like him
Fanny
though
is one of them.
because he's Navy.
Wendy, a little louder.
They like William because he's Navy. So Liz is right. He is kind of an in-between, but they quickly pull him in. Mrs. Norris wants to be a major domo. So her setting things up and explaining things gives her a stage manager sort of role. And Fanny has ingratiated herself to Lady Bertram by being her servant, her essentially her and has become indispensable because Lady Bertram doesn't want to get off the sofa, right, or get her hand off a dog. So, you know, she's got one hand in needlework, but Fanny brings it to her. Fanny makes her tea.
Yeah.
Brings her.
Does the hard parts of the needlework.
Yeah.
What?
She does all the hard parts of the
It's the hard parts
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
organizing.
I got her past her difficulties.
Yeah. So we keep noting things are changing for Fanny. When in this section tonight do they really change for her?
When the girls leave, when Julia and Mariah leave,
Yep.
that's when Mary Crawford needs a friend.
Yep. Everybody
So-
keeps peeling off.
And when she gets invited for dinner, that seems to be a turning point.
Yeah.
That she's, you know, Fanny's still, I don't know if she has officially come, you know, she never had an official coming out. The scene back in volume 1 of her first ball, you know, wasn't like any literary character's first ball that you've ever read about. Like no one even notices really that it's Fanny's first ball, except that she's aware that it is.
I think Mary says at Mariah's wedding, you'll be.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a new dress,
Mary says she
technically.
will be, and she's
Yeah.
bought a new dress for that, but we don't see that. I mean, so
Right.
that's what I like. That's not narrated to
Right,
us.
right.
And
Fanny's coming out.
it doesn't seem like anybody has noticed, like she said, that she accidentally ends up at the Grants, right, hanging out with Mary Crawford, and that they make that a regular occurrence. And that they take walks together and they talk together, and she goes to the house but nobody seems to notice that. Like, no, so when she gets invited for dinner, I felt like the reason Mrs. Norris is so like all in uproar is because she hasn't noticed anything about Fanny. Because why
Right.
would she?
Mhm.
Why would she notice anything that's happening to Fanny?
Well, let's go
Well,
back to.
and
well,
Sir
let me ask you-
Bertrand,
Oh, sorry.
I have a quick backstory question. But Fanny has been brought into this family.
Right.
There was a point at which they brought this child in who was related. She's a niece.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the way she's treated has to do with who Fanny is herself and how they see her from the beginning. But can we formalize that a little bit of what's Fanny's place? So is Fanny perhaps an outsider or an in-between, Joellen?
She does not treat it like anybody else in the family, right?
Right.
Do they miss her at all when they all go to the drawing room to greet Sir Thomas? He's
Nope.
the only one who misses her. This is a
Right.
Where's
very
Fanny?
unusual chapter for Sir Thomas, isn't it? And yeah, where's my Fanny?
Right.
And I can't remember, there's something else along that line from that chapter as well. And so in fact, who almost notices Fanny for the first time? We know that Sir Thomas's reaction to her physically is that she's changed, she's a pretty young woman, et cetera, et cetera. Has Crawford ever spoken to her before, so far as we know?
no.
Not really.
Not
At least
really.
not that I'm aware of, not that's made a point of.
Right.
But
He asked her to dance when he was you mean the brother that
no, not Tom, Sir Henry
oh.
Crawford.
Oh. Henry,
He suddenly
he asked her
talking
to
to her.
dance once when he was trying to escape a conversation. But
No,
then
no,
That
no,
was
that was
Tom.
Tom. That was Tom.
was
That
that
was
Tom?
Tom.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
No,
yeah.
I think that Crawford just has to flirt with somebody. There's
Yes.
nobody else around, and there are no other young ladies around. She's around, and he's got like 2 weeks there. He's like, okay, I'm gonna make this a fun project, try to get her to like me,
Mhm.
you know? And it's very embarrassing to poor Fanny, all the attention he gives her.
But
I
he
think-
has noticed her, at least. Now his sister says there's nobody else to notice. But
Right.
let's kind of track this. What in chapter 23, which is 2 volume 5, I wrote here Henry reflects. For Henry, he's reflecting, reminiscing.
What page are you on? Or what?
This
what
is
page are you on?
chapter 23, 208 in our
Okay,
text.
but where are we in
Toward
the,
the end, like 3 or 4 pages from the end of chapter 23.
That poor Rushworth in his 2 and 40 speeches.
Yeah, that's fine. And in that paragraph, we'll look down in just a minute, but poor Rushworth in his 2 and 40 speeches. Here, he's really praising Fanny.
You are Mr. Rushworth's best friend. Your kindness and patience can never be forgotten. Your indefatigable patience in trying to make it possible for him to learn his part, and trying to give him a brain which nature had denied.
Yeah. And so Fanny colored and said nothing. And he goes on. Okay, next paragraph. It is as a dream, a pleasant dream, he exclaimed, breaking forth again after a few minutes of musing. I shall always look back on our theatricals with exquisite pleasure. There was such an interest, such an animation, such a spirit diffused. Everybody felt it. We were all alive. There was employment, hope, solicitude, bustle for every hour of the day. Always some little objection, some little doubt, some little anxiety to be got over. I was never happier. He doesn't mention Maria.
No,
But he mentions-
Fanny's right that he is so full of it. He's saying these things. None of these things are the things that he enjoyed about it.
Oh,
He
I don't
enjoyed
agree
Mariah
with
and her kisses and her
Yeah,
attention.
in the next paragraph, we get Fanny's response, and she puts
Yeah.
it right
Yeah,
on
good for
Maria.
her.
Counter me, but my interpretation of that paragraph before is that he's not thinking of Mariah at all. They're doing something.
Oh, I think he's avoiding saying what he really thinks because he can't say any of those things out loud.
No, Mariah doesn't.
You don't
mean
think
much.
so?
None of them mean much. He's saying we were all busy. We were employed.
But
Because-
Fanny says when they were employed, they were all angry at each other and
That's
everything.
what-
Yeah.
By the end,
Trouble
by
and-
the end.
Like it wasn't a pleasant experience. He's
Not for
forgotten
Fanny.
all of that.
Not
Yeah.
for Fanny,
Well,
but for everybody
We'll
else.
learn
Yeah.
that one way that Fanny matures is through selective remembering.
Okay.
Which
I do
always
I
goes
do
on.
think that in this novel and in others too, but you know, Jane Austen is super, you know, one sort of political way that she gets is her critique of the idleness of the gentry, you know, and it really comes through in this, that like the whole theatricals was just like they were just, it's because none of them had anything better to do, you know. And then here we go to Henry, and he's like jealous of William, who's a very lowly sailor, but he's jealous. He says he's jealous
For a
of
minute.
yeah, for a minute, you know, gosh, it must be great to have like something to do. And then like, you know, he gets distracted and then he gets excited about hunting again and, you know, whatever.
Mhm.
But, you know, I think Austen is being very explicit in this novel about the dangers of idleness
Yeah.
on a weak mind. And Henry's whole, you know, the scene, we're not there quite yet, but the scene where I read ahead maybe by one chapter. Have we read where he shares his plans with his sister?
No,
Oh,
About-
wait.
okay, never mind. But Henry gets into trouble because he's idle, and I think that's made very clear.
Mhm.
He keeps coming this
Basically,
close to being a decent guy. And then he
And then he
goes up again.
And he blows it.
but
And his real self is exposed.
I suggested that in this last chapter, 24 for today, volume 2, chapter 6, that Henry Crawford gets a little more complicated. That we can't, Austen does not write flat characters. If any of you have read E.M. Forster's aspects of the novel, have you heard of flat and round characters before?
Mhm.
Here are just two big little squibs from that. We'll talk more about this later. But a flat character is two-dimensional, comes on and always says the same thing. I will never leave Mr. Micawber. I think that's in David Copperfield. Lady Bertram is close to being a flat character,
Mhm.
but Forster gives incredible arguments that Jane Austen cannot write a flat character, that even Lady Bertram pushes the bubble just a little bit. Did we see any of that in tonight's reading?
Yeah, yeah.
She was agitated. Keep watching for that later. And that Austen only wrote round characters. On the contrary, she said Dickens only wrote flat characters. It shouldn't work, but somehow he makes it work, that they're in their great novels. But Austen cannot for the life of her write a flat character. So they're all a little complicated. And if you look at the section toward the end of chapter 24, last couple of pages, where
Is that 6? Is that part 2,
chapter
6?
6, right,
Okay.
last couple of pages in, a paragraph beginning, to Henry Crawford, they gave a different feeling. This is just before Lady Bertram has said, I wonder anybody can ever go to sea. So William has been talking, his uncle,
What page are you on in your Penguin?
218 bottom.
I'm sorry,
His uncle has
218?
been checking him, you know, for
It's almost the end of the chapter.
the last page for us on 218. To Henry Crawford, they gave a different feeling. He longed to have been at sea and seen and done and suffered as much. His heart was warmed, his fancy fired, and he felt the highest respect for a lad who before he was 20 had gone through such bodily hardships and given such proofs of mind. The glory of heroism, of usefulness, of exertion, of endurance made his own habits of selfish indulgence appear in shameful contrast. And he wished he had been a William Price, distinguishing himself and working his way to fortune and consequence with so much self-respect and happy ardor instead of what he was. He's capable of feeling this whether it lasts or not. And we saw earlier when he was talking about the theatricals, just look at the language he was using. We had occupation, you know, there's as close as he gets to, so far at least, to reflection, right? not exactly like Fanny's rhapsodies, but we see, just keep this in mind as we keep going, especially in the next week's reading. Of course, we're told the narrator is just, you know, putting a pin in the balloon. The wish was rather eager than lasting, and he's just as happy being rich. Let's turn back very quickly to chapter 22, which is chapter 4 in other volumes, and where and Mary and Fanny Crawford are in the shrubbery. And this is a good way to end, by even contrasting what Crawford is capable of in getting out of himself with what Fanny is. The shrubbery section in the Penguin begins on page 193. It's about 1, 2, 3, 4 pages in to the text.
And begins with.
This is pretty, very pretty, and go on down in that.
Okay. Yep. This is very pretty.
Yep. Okay.
This is
She's
pretty.
talking then
Okay.
about how quickly nature changes things. 3 years ago, the shrubbery was nothing. Responses to this section.
Oh, it's about the change that's going on within Fanny too.
Okay. Yep.
Who she was 3 years ago. There's no question about it.
Mm-hmm.
And if anyone faculty, she talks about how wonderful, how very wonderful. Anyone? The operations of time and changes of the human mind.
And she
Yep.
talks about memory.
Yes.
That memory is sometimes retentive, so serviceable, so obedient. At other times, so bewildered and so weak. And at others again, so tyrannic, so beyond control. We are, to be sure, a miracle every way, but our powers of recollecting and forgetting do seem particularly past finding out.
Not just recollecting, but forgetting.
Forgetting.
Mhm.
That in mind as we go along. And on the next page, so this is Fanny at her most rhapsodic yet, right? Reflective.
Mhm.
On the next page, she's trying to, extend to Mary Crawford. This is such a quiet simplicity in the plan of the walk. She's praising Mrs. Grant's work here. And Mary Crawford carelessly responds, yes. Till I came to Mansfield, I had not imagined a country parson ever aspired to a shrubbery or anything of the kind. Someone want to describe what goes on coming from Fanny in that next paragraph? Did it really strike you?
Mm-hmm.
Read it with feeling. Shall we all read it? Let's read it together. It says, I'm so glad to see the evergreens thrive. Fourth line down after evergreen general. Go. The evergreen. How beautiful. How welcome. So read with me, really. Get your mouth around
How
it.
wonderful the evergreen. When one
When
thinks of it,
how
Astonishing a
a
variety
of nature.
of nature.
In some
of
countries,
countries.
we know the
the tree that
that
sheds
sheds
its
its
leaf
leaf is
is
the variety. But that does not make it less amazing that the
That
same
same
soil and the same sun
sun
should nurture plants differing
different in the
in the
first
first rule and law of their
of their
existence.
existence. You will think me rhapsodizing. What is that? The first rule and law of their existence. And can we extrapolate what she's saying here? The same soil and the same sun from plant life?
Mhm. How we're all here together, and yet you are you, and I'm not. I'm so different from you, right?
Sure.
The person who notices nothing versus the person who notices everything, or the person who can rhapsodize about nature, and the other person who goes, tree, oh yes, there was a tree.
Mm-hmm.
And Edmund and her and Mariah and Julia you know, we're all in this one place,
Mhm.
and yet how very different we all are.
Especially out of doors, Fanny says. I am very apt to get into this sort of wondering strain. One cannot fix one's eyes on the commonest natural production without finding food for a rambling fancy. And our notes say that's more associative thinking. And she makes the most of what she's witnessing and living here and letting her mind loose on it. This is very romantic. The romantic poets, etc. However, this novel, and you might think about this novel is high realism. I mean, Austen really loved Cowper and loved a lot of romantic poets, but she's really known for writing among the first really realist novels. And we can kind of see what we think about this as the novel goes on. What strains there are here, and maybe that even the narrator feels. So we have Henry reflecting. Oh, Fanny speaks. I forgot that part. When Henry was reflecting about the theatricals, remember at the dinner in chapter 23, he's just been making small talk, trying to draw her out, and she might respond only with what she has to say, and very little at that. But then he's really pushing her about the theatricals. Don't you agree? Don't you agree? How does she respond?
As I am concerned, sir, I would not have delayed his return for a day. My uncle disapproved it all so entirely when he did arrive that, in my opinion, everything had gone quite far enough.
And Henry's Crawford is silenced, isn't he? In fact, before she says that, the paragraph begins. Oh, no, it was just after it. She had never spoken so much at once to him in her life before, and never so angrily to anyone. When her speech was over, so Fanny's upped it a notch when Fanny speaks. She trembled and blushed at her own daring. But then Crawford is stopped, and he replies in a calmer, graver tone, as if, at least, Austen always qualifies appearing as if, but as if, where am I now? As if the candid result of conviction. And we don't know exactly whether it's a candid conviction or not. I believe you are right. It was more pleasant than prudent. We were getting too noisy. And he turned. So Fanny has effect here. There's a whole lot that's been going on in these 6 chapters. And even before, maybe even starting the reading for next time, get your rubber fingers out, or just find a good way to just
Flipping back and forth.
Well, just turning pages through. As I said earlier, it's just amazing how much, just kind of skimming, letting your eye fall, and you might notice some things you hadn't noticed before. So it's kind of reminding you what's been going on in order. And we've not been talking necessarily in order tonight, and we don't need to, because there are different paths that we can go down, different threads to pull. But it's always good to be able to go back to that. Yeah.
Question.
Yep.
So when Jane talks about Henry Crawford, she uses a lot of
I mean, the narrator.
When the narrator,
Thank
talks
you.
about
Yep.
Henry Crawford, there are many qualifiers, right? He speaks as if. So I don't think I could be wrong because I don't actually remember, but other characters, like when she's talking about Tom or Edmund, she doesn't say, he responds as if he felt this. The narrator says, he says this and she says that. But with Henry, there's always an appearance of falsehood. You don't know if he feels that way or he just looks like he feels
ambivalence,
that way.
yeah. And we get apparently with Mary as well as Henry. Why those two? They're not necessarily.
I think.
Go ahead.
I think that this is being filtered. That the narrator's telling is being inflected with Fanny's suspicion. Fanny is, deeply suspicious of both of
Right.
these characters. You know, she's the only one who saw clearly what was going on with the flirtation with Mariah, and she's suspicious of Mary too. So I think, you know, it's that sort of blending of the authorial voice with the character's perspective that's so subtle in this book, but it's, you know, she's going in and out of it. So that's how I read that, is I think there are some places, and I don't think we're there yet, there are some places where the narrator gives us a straight up narrator's take on the character, but I don't think this part is it. I think this part is inflected by Fanny's
And learning to
suspicion.
distinguish those, and they change so fast, is tricky. Jean?
I was going to say, these two characters are always play acting. They're
Okay,
never
good
honest.
point.
Mary and Henry.
Mary and Henry,
Crawfords.
they're always play acting. Putting forth an appearance of something, but that they're not.
In my YA adaptation version, they are I made them twins, and they're twins who were like child stars on a Disney show. Like they're actual actors who used to be kind of famous, and you know, whatever, because of that idea that they're always acting. They're always.
But to be fair, other people are acting also, right? We've talked about how Aunt Norris does. Sir Thomas does sometimes. So keep that in mind, because basically, I mean, there are people today in performance theory who argue that we're always, all of us characters in books are performing, giving circumstances, given who we're talking to. That doesn't mean there isn't a core there. But the two Crawford characters who come from London and totally different upbringing are certainly fingered here. And so
isn't this right after he talks about he's going to make it his mission for Fanny to fall in love with him?
Does that happen in this section? I can't remember either.
Yeah, it's either right before or right after this.
I think I think it's in chapter 24. Does it start? Yeah, chapter 24, the beginning of this chapter.
I cannot be satisfied without Fanny Price, without making a small hole.
Let's not oversimplify that either. Because you might even look back to compare what he's saying about Fanny to what he was saying to his aunt and sister early on about Julia and Mariah, when they were warning him against. Does he even know whether he's serious? That's a question through here. But keep your antenna up. I think Henry Crawford, it's ambivalent, but we're not going to be knee-jerk the way Fanny is in the way we look at him. Okay.
What do you mean by that?
Oh, just he's just a bad guy throughout. Fanny has no room for him at all. It doesn't matter whether he was speaking candidly or not. She says, "Oh, what a corrupt mind," etc. So I think that it deserves some attention on our part.
She mentions, or someone mentions, he lacks discipline and self-insight, and I think that that's way beyond not whether he's a good man or a bad man. He's a self-indulgent man. You know, when he said about the horses, right? He said, "Oh, and it's so good to be me because I have the money to have horses and groomsmen."
But also, a couple of times tonight, we saw him as more reflective. And you can read that again and decide whether you think he's completely, performing or, being disingenuous and fraudulent or not.
Oh, no, I don't think that.
The more many times I reread these chapters, I'm thinking about how Fanny is viewing these people and their roles in society. And I think when we think about flat and round characters, it's interesting to think about Fanny. Every other character in this book doesn't do anything that is very surprising in terms of who they are in their roles of class in this novel. But they have different degrees, right? Like Henry is one extreme, Edward is a level. There are all these different levels that I feel like Fanny is wrapping her mind around as she studies this group of people. So that the real roundness of Fanny comes from observing all these other people. While they sort of are kind of expected and flat, not totally flat, but we can expect what their reactions are going to be because of how Austen sets up this class structure in the novel itself. So I think it's right to be suspicious of Henry Crawford because Fanny, that's the role he's playing. That's his role in this novel, is not to surprise us in any way, except for it's like, well, he might be this kind of way. But Fanny never trusts him. And that speaks to just how Austen sets this book up in a way that we can't really challenge those roles. Those characters aren't going to be the surprise for us. Fanny is the one who's
So
who
far
we learn the most from.
So far. We've got to get off here, but chapter 24, 1 to 3rd page, the narrator is speaking. And Henry Crawford has just stopped. Find moderation itself, said Mary. He has just said what he wants, and he's being a little flippant here, isn't he? I want her to be interested in all my possessions and pleasures, try to keep me longer at Mansfield, and feel when I go away that she shall never be happy again. I want nothing more. And his sister says, moderation itself. Now look at the next paragraph. This is the narrator. And without attempting any farther remonstrance, she left Fanny to her fate, a fate which, had not Fanny's heart been guarded in a way unsuspected by Miss Crawford, might have been a little harder than she deserved. For although there doubtless are such unconquerable young ladies of 18, or one should not read about them, as are never to be persuaded into love against their judgment by all that talent, manner, attention, and flattery can do, I, first person pronoun used very rarely, I have no inclination to believe Fanny one of them who can't be cajoled by anything, or to think that with so much tenderness of disposition and so much taste as belonged to her, she could have escaped heart whole from the courtship, though the courtship only of a fortnight, of such a man as Crawford, in spite of there being some previous ill opinion of him to be overcome, had not her affection been engaged elsewhere. With all the security which love of another and disesteem of him could give to the peace of mind he was attacking, his continued attentions, continued but not obtrusive, and adapting themselves more and more to the gentleness and delicacy of her character, obliged her very soon to dislike him less than formerly. She had by no means forgotten the past, and she thought as ill of him as ever, but she felt his powers. He was entertaining, and his manners were so improved, so polite, so seriously and blamelessly polite, that it was impossible not to be civil to him in return. If you find the last paragraph in chapter 24, this is after, and this is all, I mean, it gets so complex. It's not black and white simple. But at the very end, after William has come home safe, he hasn't had an accident or anything. When it was proved, however, to have done William no harm, she could allow it to be a kindness. Henry Crawford was alone on the horse, and even reward the owner with a smile when the animal was 1 minute tendered to his use again, and the next, with the greatest cordiality, and in a manner not to be resisted, made over to his use entirely, so long as he remained in Northamptonshire. So the narrator is complicating things a little bit about Fanny. She doesn't say that she thinks that the guard of her affection for Edmund will be worn down, but she's even illustrating a little bit that even a Fanny could be charmed by someone like Henry. Anyway, see what you think about that. And that's kind of where we're left as we go into the next 6 chapters. And don't ever hesitate to back up and pull things forward, because we're not getting everything discussed yet. Okay, we really are over what we've promised. But really, thanks for everyone being here. Any other last quick words?
Just that part that you just read, Joellen, I think is interesting too, because we as the reader have been gathering Fanny's love for Edmund all along, but this is the most the narrator has actually acknowledged it. So I think the narrator's been very reticent about it, but it's been obvious to us as readers. But here the narrator confirms, like, yep, Fanny's in love.
I think the other part of this chapter is the next page, or the page after that, where, you know, we just talked about all these things that I guess it's a few pages down, about him, you know, thinking about her and her starting to not dislike him as much. But then you go a little farther along and he says, you know, I started to notice that he could value her attraction, increased twofold for her sensibility. And he was no longer in doubt of the capabilities of her heart. She had feeling, genuine feeling. It would be something to be loved by such a girl and to excite the first ardors of her young, unsophisticated mind. She interested him more than he had foreseen. A fortnight was not enough. His stay became indefinite.
That's in chapter 24. Yeah. So we've read that tonight too. So really, even if you're a first time reader, flipping pages or rereading or whatever, will do you good service. Okay, Liz Kenny, you're going to be gone next week. Hope you can make it. Okay. Anyone else? Thanks.
All right.
Enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Thank you.